I'm going to start off with a disclaimer. I've had a fair amount of experience with public speaking and relatively comfortable with that. But this is the first time I've really given any kind of a presentation of length for a subject that I really didn't know anything about. And in the past, it's always been something I was, the career. I was a dentist, and we did a lot of connecting. I was with Kaiser Permanente and what is it? Networking. That's the word I'm looking for, across the country and actually internationally. And so I could speak about something that I was intimately familiar with. When I decided that I'd speak on labor, it's because I've always had a little bit of an interest. I see union as the only way that people can bring some level of power against, in opposition, rather than one person working against a corporation, if you will. And I've also always been really interested in people who have the courage to fight for something that they want or feel they need, to work against the system, and not only in labor but in other walks of life. So getting back to, this is something that is a little new for me. So I'm going to quote one of the people who attends the current events in Lake Oswego, where I go on a regular basis. I know him as Dr. Phil. I really don't know his last name. But at one time he says, well, this will probably not, he's reading something and says, this will probably be not as smooth as I usually am. And so we won't let him forget that statement, but it may not be as smooth as I'd like it to be, and I'm going to rely more on notes than I've kind of used to. I'd like to kind of have things really rehearsed and memorized and what have you, but the length of this, I blocked at doing that over and over again. So I'm going to hang around this podium a little more with my notes. Labor organization really started very, very early in the country's history. One of my sources says, it's almost like when people, or as soon as when people stepped off the boat. As early as 1648, we had a guild of coopers, barrel makers and shoemakers form in Boston, and they wanted to maintain trade standards and hold a monopoly on trade with an established qualified workforce. The idea in these craft unions that followed this first one was to guard against diluted and cheap labor. And another issue that, along with their wages, what they could charge for their labor, and preventing the dilution, they were also interested in a shorter workday. Workers in the U.S. played a significant role, or in the colonies, played a significant role in the Revolution. It was carpenters who were the host group and dressed up as Mohawk Indians for the Boston Tea Party. Yes, and it was a Carpenters Hall in Philadelphia where the Declaration of Independence was signed. So, let's figure out how to do. There we go. Up until the 1800s, there wasn't a lot of really organized activity. Things were sporadic, and a variety of issues that people had movements about. So withholding of wages, inadequate food, fee controls that the coopers, butchers, bakers, and I'm assuming candlestick makers too, were against. And even the high price of wheat in 1741. In 1713, there was a bread riot in Boston that was triggered by a speculator. There was literally a shortage of wheat, and the speculator was finding it more economical or more profitable to ship the wheat overseas than to keep it in town and help feed people, and this led to a riot in Boston. Through the 1600s, 1700s, the industrial worker really, almost didn't exist. So we were talking here in these early guilds, trade unions, as skilled workers, that something that they knew how to do, that took some education, took some experience, maybe took an apprenticeship type of thing, versus somebody who maybe now you have an education, but you can walk in and start in a job here or there or there. Not only were these craft unions interested in how much, they can charge for their labor, what the work hours that they would have, make sure that they weren't having competition from lesser skilled people, but there was this sense of wanting to promote a just society. And some of the things that showed up in the Declaration of Independence were held by these people. That labor had a value in and of itself, that we want some social equality, that having people who, with their honest labor, could earn a real living would become independent, virtuous citizens. Figure out how to make this thing work a little better. But with the advent of the steam engine, better use of water power, and creating the Industrial Revolution, and people being aware of how that really had changed England and brought along a lot of slums and hardships for people working in those mills in England, that the labor leaders in our country saw these changes as running counter to their vision about a just society, and that it was creating two distinct classes, the rich and the poor. This word classes showing up very early in our country's history. So, some of the rhetoric that follows with this. The mechanics and working class of Philadelphia talking about how hard they work, only get a scanty portion of what they produce, and what they do get is totally dependent upon the will of the employer. Here in 1829, writing the Working's Men Declaration of Independence, and using that terminology, that declaration really rang in deeply with the people of the country. But here they're complaining about laws, tax laws, corporate laws, landlord laws that favor one class and oppress the others. I'm starting to see things back in the early 1800s that we don't seem to have resolved, that just keep going on in different forms. In the early 1820s, Frances Wright shows up in America, and she is a feminist. Let's see where I am in my notes here for a second here. Yeah, an abolitionist, a social reformer. She actually becomes a U.S. citizen in 1825 and establishes a utopian community in Tennessee that only lasts about 5 years. But this is part of it, she says, did you fight your revolution? Did you become independent to have your sons and daughters crushed by industry? And have neglect, poverty, disease, all the things you can see there. As a Scot, I have one of my son-in-laws that has some Scotch ancestry, and he frequently lets me know how advanced or progressive the Scots were. And I believe it's one of the first nations, if not the first, to have kind of universal education. And bringing that along, Frances Wright demanded, one of her demands was free publication, public education for all children over 2 years of age. She attacked organized religion, greed, marriage, capitalism, and there's Frances. I forgot to put her up there. But this is what a lot of people thought about her. This is a woman who didn't know her place, just this gobbledygoose, and she should be hissed. As a interesting side note, when the Marquis de Lafayette came back to the United States in 1824-25 to tour kind of triumphantly because of his assistance with the revolution, she accompanied him on a part of that trip as part of her speaking tour. So back to this sense of we're creating a rich and a poor set of classes. And here again, there's talk about the laws that, in this case, are facilitating education for the wealthy while neglecting the common schools. Again, has anything really changed much in this country? So we're talking about vouchers and our public schools. So here in the 1800s, the first part of the century, conflict is starting to escalate because of demographic changes. And this was really eye-opening to me. For some reason, I always kind of thought, America lived on farms, agrarian until maybe after World War II. And in the North, that wasn't the case. We had 70% living in farms in 1820, but that figure changed dramatically in just 40 years. And that shift helping to create some of the rising tensions between the employed and the employer. And then we had, during that same time, 5 million people come to the United States, mostly from Western Europe, Ireland, Germany, and Great Britain. As part of the escalation, when these conflicts would happen, when maybe a local strike or some kind of a lockout occurring, the courts getting involved were finding with some consistent basis that unions were a conspiracy. Not only were they going to be injuring trade, but they're to incite riots, assault, battery, and therefore they should be illegal. In response to that, this handbill in New York again mentions that the rich are the only judges of the wants of the poor man. In response. Along with this, we had two different economies developing in the country. One in the north and one in the south. Yeah, the northern mills were using southern cotton, and then the south was importing some northern goods, but they really were distinctly different economies, as shown by the transportation systems. In 1860, the two transportation systems touched at only one point in the United States, in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And I think that was primarily train type of thing. And there's something in my memory that says maybe even in the South that the gauge of the train tracks was different, the width of them. So you couldn't easily shift, just drive a train from one to the other and keep going. And that had some impact too on how the Civil War played out. Here we have an issue about contract laws adding to the conflict. So we get a strike. We're successful in Philadelphia for the legislature to say the working day is 10 hours. But because of the interpretation of contract law, if I want to sign up with this mill, the employer can have me sign a contract that says I can work beyond the 10 hours. There was a sense that there's equal power. Not only the company, the corporation, and then the individual worker being equal in their power in the contract, so the worker can be held to this. I'll slide on from there. So we don't want to forget women in 1850, and again, maybe there's a sense, thinking back to in high school history, and maybe even in college, and that it's the men in the labor force, and then women are all living on farms, if you will. Getting back to my maybe naive view, but we had 500,000 women out of a 6 million workforce employed as domestic teachers, factory workers. And they were active. And so we see in 1825, the tailorresses in New York struck. In 1828, the mill women in Dover, New Hampshire, struck in protest of the factory rules of fines for arriving late, no talking on the job. You got to go to church. And they weren't successful. The leaders were fired and blacklisted, and the rest of that workforce went back to work. In Massachusetts, a system was set up and these are the Lowell girls, to have the young ladies working in the mills be able to live in essentially dormitories with matrons there to guard their virtue and oversee things, if you will. And in these dormitories, they would be fed and clothed and sheltered. After a short period of time, these rules and regulations became prison-like. The meals became bread and gravy, according to one of my sources. And the Lowell girls didn't like that, and they stood up and they organized. They protested and even created their own newspaper. So they protesting bad lighting, poor ventilation. It's hot in the summer and damp and cold in the winter with smoky air from the oil lamps, and company script for pay instead of U.S. cash. Another theme that seems to start to build here in terms of the company town, the company store, the company money that essentially kind of traps people. And so these young ladies struck several times, attempting to gain shorter work days from 13 and a half to maybe 11 or 10 hours a day. So the shoemakers were concerned about the impact of mechanism, the mechanical ability to start to build the shoes fairly early on, and created their own newspaper. And here in 1844, this is 4 years before the Communist Manifesto comes out, we're seeing the use of terms as capital and labor, and that capital and labor stand opposed. And I found that kind of enlightening that early on, and here in the United States, that kind of rhetoric and terminology being utilized. So in somewhere in that period of time, I didn't get the date down, in Lynn, Massachusetts, 5,000 men, 10,000 women struck, oh no, there it is, at 1860, okay, struck and marched through the streets in a blizzard. 10 days later, 10,000 marched. The strike went on through April, and they won higher wages, but no recognition as a union. And over 20,000 shoemakers were ultimately involved in this strike, along with a sympathetic association of mechanics. And this is some of the response. These are newspaper headlines of that time. You know, we've got revolution, we've got rebellion, we've got conflict, again, between capital and labor. So things weren't progressing in any kind of achieving step by step by step. You know, there were fits, there were starts, there were more factors maybe to slow any progress in gaining in the labor movement than not. One of them being the inability to conquer distance. You know, you had to do it physically, if you will. And so movements were city-centered, much less state or federal, national of any kind. There was this tension that had begun at the beginning, or at the start of the country, between skilled and unskilled. And we've got racial prejudices, not only black and white, but Irish and white. And just the straight competition for jobs. You know, if Irishman gets a job, I don't. If a woman gets a job, I don't. If a child gets the job, I don't. And because people being desperate would be willing to go in and work and be a strike breaker, or you had religious differences within the workforce. You had the Protestants that really settled the country and had a real issue with Catholics, but then the Irish coming in, and so you have a lot more Catholics and that kind of conflict there. And just as today, you had the people who thought since they've been here for 100 years, they've been here for forever, and any new immigrant is unwelcome. And you don't want somebody like that taking your job. Another interesting thing that I ran across is that as the politicians started to get involved, take up some of these issues, the nativists had a tendency to move towards the Republican Party, while the Irish moving into the Democratic Party. That actually ended up in sort of diluting and slowing progress around labor-employer relations. relationships, because those issues would get mixed in with all the other issues within the party. Okay, you're supposed to change. Up. Civil War comes along, and that actually brings a lot of unity. So your concerns about your individual union are subsumed to the fact that we've got to produce to support the troops, and then in the war economy, it's starting to lift everybody's boat a little bit, and again that takes some of the steam out of agitation and the things to fight for, if you will, because conditions are improving a little bit. And again, we see contract law come into play. This sense that there's equality between the individual worker and a company, when in reality there really isn't. And in this case, the contract law being seen as an injured worker didn't deserve compensation. When you signed up for the job, you knew what the risks were. You NFL player, and if a contract was for a year's work, and if you quit early, you didn't need to be paid anything. But if the company had already done a bunch of things in the contract with who they contracted with, they deserved to be paid to that point. The post-Civil War period, I'm a little bit ahead there, geez. It was a time of financial crisis and depressions. 1873, 1893, just to go and to stop there in terms of the timeline I'm in right now. And this started to refuel the social and economic unrest and desire for change within the system. And so I've kind of wondered over time, without having the energy to go really find out until I got involved in this presentation, I've wondered, where did our disdain for socialism as Americans come from? Where did anarchism pop into this? Because when you start reading about what follows, those words are there. Those things are happening. So I want to take a second to, or a few minutes to explore those. When the Pilgrims arrived in the colony, created the colony, they needed to work together for survival. They really created kind of a quasi-socialistic system. In terms of taking care of your neighbors, sharing things, and over time, as it got to be less of a problem for survival, that's ended up changing in the country into more of our, our free market, free labor type of approach. But the Pilgrims were followed by some communistic ventures, such as the Shaker colonies, Rappites, and the Zorrites during 1776 to 1824. We had a lot of German immigrants coming in after 1848, and I needed to find out, well, what was that all about? I thought, we had the French Revolution, and then that was kind of, things went on from there. But in the 1848, there was a major food crisis in Europe, and there was the publication of the Communist Manifesto, and we had a second revolution in France, and the creation of the Second Republic, if you will. But it didn't stop in France. Again, for kind of themes that seem to follow through. This actually was called the People's Spring in 1948, as there were uprisings in also the Netherlands, Italy, the German states, Habsburg Empire, up in Sweden, Poland, and a number of places. And so we have these Germans fleeing the German states and coming here to the United States with this fervor for change and some sense of the politics of socialism. They brought over a social concept that they had, or a social organization called Turner Societies that they formed. And these things were essentially, or originally, were to promote physical health. They were like having what is it in school when you go out and pardon? PE. Yeah, PE. These were things promoting, physical training, and actually Turner is German for gymnastics. And so I think of those pictures of the riding, the pommel horses and that kind of deal going on. But there was this sense underneath them, because they were also a social thing, a place for interaction, that the organizations were socialistic, if you will. And a particular German in 1852 started a newsletter in order to disseminate the teachings of the Communist Manifesto. And this was in Chicago. His newsletter was called The Revolution. And the first issue actually had a article penned by Marx himself. But socialism had a slow go here in the United States. We had these Germans and these French that spoke German and French, and their newspapers were in those languages, and so they're more talking amongst themselves than with the population that had been here prior to them. And the American people just weren't really attracted to it. And they saw it sort of as some kind of a foreign thing over there, these immigrants, talking about this kind of stuff. And then socialism starts to become confounded with anarchism, which was believed at the time to be synonymous with, and I love these words,